Hi there, my name is Lex von Clark, and today I would like to talk to you about my research into novel theories of primitive accumulation produced by the Chinese scholars Wen Tiezhen and Jin Hui. So this is a very arcane title. These are some big words, and I don't think most people are going to have any idea what I'm talking about if I just jump in. So I think it's useful to start with some orienting questions. My research was primarily concerned with the topic of how did capitalism begin and how has it spread? It is common for us today to assume that capitalism is something that has always existed. We're told that it's simply human nature. But if we look at history, we can see that capitalist class relations, that is to say, the existence of an ownership class and a working class, is not something that has existed for all of human history. It is hardly natural. Rather, it is a product of the past few centuries, and is indeed something that can be traced to very specific origins in 14th and 15th century England. But how did we move from before capitalism to capitalism? What bridged the gap? Well, this is where primitive accumulation comes in. Primitive accumulation is a term popularized by Karl Marx that refers to the processes by which pre-capitalist modes of production are transformed into the capitalist modes of production. The most common and classical example of this is the movement from a feudal mode of production, characterized by the existence of lords and peasants, to a capitalist mode of production, characterized by the existence of capitalists and workers. A very helpful way to think about the distinction between pre-capitalist and capitalist modes of production is by considering the role of the market in each of these societies. In pre-capitalist societies, there was no need for the average person to sell their labor on a market in order to survive, because most of the goods they needed to survive and sustain their families were things that they themselves produced. Peasants farmed their own land and grew their own crops for themselves and their children. However, under a capitalist society, we must work to survive. The market is not an opportunity, it is an imperative. If you want to eat, if you want to have clothes, if you want to live in a house, for the most part, you're going to have to work for it. You're going to have to work for a wage so that you can then go and buy those things from the market. The market is now a necessity. And the way that we move from the market as an opportunity to the market as a necessity is by getting rid of people's abilities to survive outside of the market. And since the peasantry has the ability to survive outside of the market because of their direct access to their own land, this means dispossessing the peasantry from that land. And this is how capitalism traditionally took root in countries like England and Prussia, where through either private evictions by landlords or public enclosures of common spaces by the government, peasants were removed from their abilities to sustain themselves and forced to rely on the market in order to purchase the goods they needed for survival. But what do we do about those countries where the peasantry was not forcefully dispossessed? America is a classical example. American farmers were exactly that. Farmers. They weren't peasants. They owned their own land and therefore could not be evicted and were much less likely to be removed from their own land by the government. Yet today, America is very clearly a super advanced capitalist country. So how do we explain this? Well, while it's difficult to specifically examine the American case, since it was just quite a while back, there is a case of this happening in modern day of primitive accumulation occurring without forcible dispossession, and this is happening in rural China. Now, when you think of rural China, you may not think of capitalism, and this makes sense. China is a country that for a good portion of the 20th century was dominated by a Soviet-style collectivist system. But today, China has some very unique characteristics that render it super useful for considering and criticizing preconceived notions of primitive accumulation. I've identified three core features that I think really show the uniqueness of China's modern land situation. The first is the lack of a landlord class. This is because following the Communist Party taking power in the early 50s, there was massive land reform. And so peasants had direct ownership of their land, and landlords today are not a major force in rural China whatsoever. So that's one avenue of dispossession that does not exist in China today. Secondly, because of their socialist legacy, they inherited a land system that is extremely unique. Under the socialist system, all rural land was owned by the collective, and this actually has remained until today. with collectives generally being understood to mean the local village governments. However, peasants no longer work in collective workforces, even if the land is still owned collectively. Instead, they have a contractual right. They are able to contract a small parcel of land from the local government that they and their family can work on individually. Now, this two-right separation, the separation of ownership and contract, has existed since, the early 80s. But the three-right separation was introduced in 2013. And so now, while the ownership stays with the commune and the peasant holds the individual contract to the land, the peasant can now take the operational right, the use of that land, and give it to someone else, a third party such as an agribusiness or another peasant. This is yet another way that dispossession in rural China has been limited, since there are no landlords to evict them, and even if the peasant outsources their operational right, they still retain the contractual right. This would seem to create a situation not amenable whatsoever to the creation of capitalist relations. And yet, the third characteristic, and possibly the most surprising given the first two, is that there has been a massive explosion of marketization in rural China, specifically in the past couple of years since the three-right separation passed. In order to untangle this complicated knot and understand really what we're looking at here, it's best to turn to some very smart Chinese political theorists who have actually experienced these processes firsthand. The first of these is Wen Tiezheng. Wen Tiezheng is a rural activist and scholar from China who is famous for reintroducing primitive accumulation to the Chinese lexicon, following it being considered largely taboo through the Maoist era. Wen has a very structural view of primitive accumulation. For Wen, the form that primitive accumulation takes is determined by its historical context. One example of this being that Wen does not consider Western-style models of development, which are premised on colonialism and hyper-extraction. He does not think they're appropriate to China because of China's modern historical and geographic context. On the other side of the primitive accumulation discussion in China is a liberal scholar named Qin Hui. Qin is liberal in the sense that he supports free markets and capitalism and civil rights. Qin has primarily criticized the overuse of primitive accumulation in China. He thinks the term has lost its meaning by being overused by too many people who simply use it to describe anything about capitalism they don't like. For Qin, primitive accumulation is actually fundamentally anti-market. This is because market exchange is premised on formal equality of participants, where primitive accumulation tramples upon such fairness by requiring coercion and dispossession. So how do we bring these two together? What lessons can we learn from reading them? Well, from Wen, the lesson is pretty straightforward. It's that primitive accumulation takes different forms in different contexts. But if we accept this raises the question of, well, if it's possible to have voluntary primitive accumulation, does that mean that capitalism is not premised on formal inequality, that the dispossession of the peasantry was somehow voluntary? This is where Qin comes in. Qin inadvertently shows us that force and dispossession are not the same thing. And while it is true that not all primitive accumulation takes a forceful form, it does all require dispossession. I bring these two together in my new concept of voluntary and involuntary primitive accumulation. Involuntary primitive accumulation is the classically forceful kind of primitive accumulation that we see in countries like England and Prussia, where peasants have no choice. They are simply removed from their land. Voluntary primitive accumulation, on the other hand, is a model that I have created that I hope to use to describe those forms of primitive accumulation that have occurred in America and places like rural China, where the peasantry does have a choice. They are not forcibly removed from their land. They are choosing to sell off their land and become landless. Though I must be clear that this is voluntary only relative to the other form of primitive accumulation, because for most of them, while they are given a choice, it is a choice between remaining in poverty and potentially living a much nicer life for them and their children. So it is really not much of a choice at all. I hope by creating these new concepts of voluntary and involuntary primitive accumulation, we can account for variations in different types of capitalist transition around the world without undermining the theoretical tradition and forced nature of capitalism itself. Thank you very much.